The Fairness Doctrine. Have you ever been watching cable news and just thought to yourself, wait a minute, aren't they supposed to show the other side of the story? Well, you're not crazy. There actually used to be a rule for that. And today, we're going to figure out exactly what happened to it. You know, if you were watching TV or listening to the radio a few decades ago, you'd notice something different. A really strong, fiery political opinion was almost always followed by someone with the complete opposite take. It felt balanced. That wasn't just a courtesy, it was an official policy. So where did it go? Let's dive in. Okay, so before we can figure out why it disappeared, we've got to get crystal clear on what this policy actually was. And that means we need to tackle the number one misunderstanding about it right off the bat. So this was the Fairness Doctrine. It was an FCC policy that ran from 1949 all the way to 1987. And it had two main parts. First, it said broadcasters couldn't just avoid the tough stuff. They had to cover important, controversial issues. And second, when they did, they had to give a voice to contrasting viewpoints. Now, this didn't mean they needed a stopwatch to make sure each side got exactly 30 seconds. It just meant that overall, the coverage had to be fair and balanced. And here it is. This is the part that trips almost everyone up. So listen close. The Fairness Doctrine is not the equal time rule. They sound similar, but they are completely different animals. Let's break it down. The Fairness Doctrine, the one that's gone, was all about public issues, big controversial ideas. The equal time rule, on the other hand, is still around today, and it's super specific. It's only about political candidates. So if one candidate for mayor gets 5 minutes of airtime, their opponent has to get the opportunity for 5 minutes too. So think of it this way. One was about ideas. The other is about people running for office. So if this thing was around for almost 40 years, and even upheld by the Supreme Court, why on earth did it just vanish? Well, the story of its disappearance is really the story of our entire media world getting turned completely upside down. So here's the quick history. It kicks off in 1949, and it's so established that the Supreme Court gives it a thumbs up in '69. It's just how things are done for decades. But then, the 1980s hit, and boom, cable TV and satellite dishes are everywhere. The game totally changes. And by 1987, the FCC decides it's obsolete and repeals it. Congress actually tried to bring it back, but a veto from President Reagan was the final nail in the coffin. So what was the logic behind getting rid of it? Well, it came down to 4 big arguments. First, the whole idea was based on scarcity, that there were only a few TV channels. With cable offering hundreds of options, that argument kind of fell apart. Second, the Reagan administration was all about deregulation, and they saw this as the government sticking its nose where it didn't belong. Third, some critics said the rule actually had a chilling effect, that broadcasters would just avoid controversial topics altogether so they wouldn't have to deal with the headache of finding an opposing view. And finally, the new thinking was, hey, let the free market handle it. People can find all the views they want now, so the rule is gone. What happens next? Well, getting rid of the Fairness Doctrine wasn't some tiny tweak in policy. Its absence completely reshaped the media universe that you and I live in right now. It's really no coincidence that almost right after the doctrine was scrapped, you saw the explosion of partisan talk radio. And just a few years after that, cable news channels designed for very specific political audiences started to pop up. Without that old rule forcing them to show contrasting views, media companies were suddenly free to build an entire brand, an entire business, around serving just one side of the aisle. And that brings us to the huge debate about its legacy. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Well, one camp says this has been a disaster, that it's fueled the political division we see everywhere and locked us all into our own little information bubbles. But the other camp says, hold on, this is just free speech, and the free market working as intended. They argue that people should be free to choose the news and opinions that they want to hear. So if some people think it was so great, why not just bring it back? Well, it is way, way more complicated now. For starters, you'd have a massive First Amendment legal battle on your hands. But even if you got past that, just think about the logistics. The old rule was for a world with like 3 big TV networks. How could you possibly enforce it today with thousands of cable channels, millions of websites, podcasts, YouTube channels? It would be an absolute logistical nightmare. But even with all those challenges, the conversation is not dead. People still talk about bringing it back. So let's take a quick look at the modern arguments for and against. The debate today pretty much boils down to this. The first side says, look, this could be a powerful tool to fight misinformation and maybe, just maybe, lower the temperature of our politics a bit. They think it would promote a healthier public conversation. The against side fires back that it's basically censorship, that it would face a political firestorm, and that, practically speaking, it's just impossible to enforce in the age of the internet. But it's not always an all-or-nothing debate. There are some more targeted ideas floating around. For instance, what if you brought it back but only for public broadcasters? You know, the channels that use the public airwaves and need an FCC license to operate anyway. That might be a more manageable way to reintroduce the concept instead of trying to regulate the entire internet. And really, that leaves us with the big central question for our modern world. Back when there were only a handful of channels controlling all the information, it made sense for fairness to be a regulation enforced by the government. But today, in a world with infinite channels and endless choices, has fairness shifted from being a regulation to being a personal responsibility? That's something we all have to decide every time we click, watch, and share.